Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be here. My name is Christine Riordan. I'm here with my co-author, Hei-Jun Roh, and we are going to be talking to you about algorithmic management in hotel housekeeping. So this is a piece of research that comes out of a large research initiative that spans multiple disciplines and institutions. It's funded by NSF. And importantly, it's in partnership with Unite Here, which is the largest hospitality workers union in the U.S. And so our group for the last 4 years has been studying the use of technologies in the hospitality sector with a particular focus on the use of algorithmic management in hotel housekeeping. I probably don't have to define AM for this audience, but AM, right, are technologies that rely on computational, aggregate data and rely on computational procedures to help kind of inform or make decisions that managers typically undertook in the past. So the quintessential model, of course, is platforms like Uber or Lyft, where managerial decision-making is substituted for by algorithms. But increasingly, we've seen these technologies spread into other settings like telecommunications, logistics, warehousing, manufacturing, and hospitality, right, where these technologies are being used to augment decisions that managers are making. And so importantly, in these kinds of settings, these technologies are integrated into pre-existing organizational practices, policies, social relationships, hierarchies, right? Meaning that even the same technology can look and be experienced very differently across different settings. And so our research is really situated in industrial relations scholarship. It's our training, it's our background, where one of the core questions that we've been thinking about is how does this technology impact discretion or autonomy in work, that latitude to have control over decisions regarding how you do your work. There's kind of an emerging debate, I'll just say very briefly, on the effects of AM on discretion and decision-making, with some arguing that it really constrains workers' experience with kind of having control over work, and others arguing that, no, there's still actually lots of opportunities for choice and decisions to be made in these systems. But scholars are increasingly converging on this idea that in order to really understand these technologies, particularly in traditional settings like hotels, we have to understand how those technologies intersect with the labor process of workers and how those spaces for discretion, which usually arise when you have some kind of uncertainty or some kind of judgment that has to be made, how those are subsequently impacted. And so this kind of drives the motivation for thinking about our question in this paper, which is a really inductive paper, how and to what extent these decision augmenting systems affect discretion in more traditional organizational settings, and what are some of the potential moderators. So we examine this in hotel housekeeping, and what I'm going to present to you is kind of a grounded inductive model, a different flavor than a lot of the papers that we've heard about so far, that really aims to unpack how these technologies are intersecting with the labor process of housekeepers. And our model hinges on these three dimensions. One is understanding exactly how AM intersects with the labor process, how that affects how GRAs or housekeepers, guest room attendants, how it impacts their ability to make decisions that deal with uncertainty, and then the salience of those impacts in relation to the overall labor practice. So we combed our data. So this is, we've had multiple years of qualitative work. We've done a number of focus groups, prototyping sessions with the technology itself, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, and observation at 2 hotels. And some of these pieces of data collection were actually oriented around different streams of our research. But throughout, we kept hearing these accounts of how decision-making was changed. So we look across our different sources of data. I should mention that, so we're concerned with hotel housekeepers or guest room attendants, GRAs. They are almost all women. All were non-white. Most were immigrants, spoke a language other than English as their first primary language. And these are typically, workers who are in low-wage settings it's an interesting case because we think of housekeeping work as relatively standardized routine work, right? You're kind of doing the same work in the rooms, cleaning rooms, arranging amenities just so. And And so it's typically thought of in the literature as a low discretion kind of job, but what we actually see is that there's some shades of gray and some nuance in discretion among workers in this setting. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of how AM works in this setting before kind of unpacking that model, the model that we inductively built. So AM, I should mention, there's a number of these different applications. There's one that has the most market share. We have a pseudonym for it. We call it Upkeep. Almost everyone in our sample actually uses this one technology. So it kind of aggregates inputs from travel forecasts, guest requests, special guest arrival times in hotel, pairs it with information about the status of rooms. So if you have a checkout room, for example, it requires a lot more cleaning, a lot more work, a lot more labor than a stayover, which is maybe just a light refresh cleaning. Maybe you have VIPs with special requests or other information about the status of rooms that are coming in. And so the purpose of AM is really to optimize room flows for management. So how to turn over rooms most efficiently, most quickly, so that you can meet demand. I should mention also that at the outset, when these technologies are implemented, a property management can go in. They usually work with the vendor. This is the main kind of point of contact a vendor has with the hotel, but they can set in priorities and preferences that become built into the system. So this might be a maximum number of credits. So different room types might be assigned different credits that one GRA could do. It could be rules around the number of floors they can travel, rules around the types of rooms that they want to have serviced first. So all of this is built into these systems up front. All of this input is kind of taken into account, and then GRAs are then dispatched out to those rooms according to those priorities. GRAs receive their assignments in handheld devices. It used to be they go into their morning meeting, their morning shift meeting, and they would get their assignments on a piece of paper attached to a clipboard. For this reason, they actually refer to their list as boards, even when they're on a device. Now it's an iPhone, or surprisingly, a later generation iPod we found is a really common device that GRAs use. They get their room assignments that way. They communicate with their supervisor through messaging in the platform. They coordinate work across departments. If they have a work order, if you need maintenance to come in and fix a leaky faucet, for example, all those work orders get put in. And they're constantly engaging with these systems throughout the day. So you start a room, you mark it on the phone, you've opened up the room, you do your work, document problems, work orders, finish it out, mark finished in your application, and then move on to the next. So there's a lot of information and data that's being collected. Excuse me, this is what it looks like. This is an example of what one looks like in the back end. So a supervisor or a dispatcher or clerk, as they're sometimes called, is usually sitting in a basement level office, monitoring in real time. These are often integrated into other technologies and softwares that they're using to track workflows and operations. And these can be kind of, managers can, just kind of like what we were hearing about with labor scheduling technologies, can fully automate this, but most often actually wind up using these to help make decisions in real time about if you have a number of guests who have do not disturb mark on their door, you may have to then reallocate rooms throughout the day to different GRAs to cover shifts. So there are lots of unpredictability, which makes actually fully automating this part of operations really difficult. And this is what a GRA sees on the phone. You can see the little broom for cleaning started, return later, do not disturb, finishing things out. So throughout all of this data, we kept hearing, as I mentioned, GRAs talking about how their decision-making was transformed. And so one of the things we started to do was to code all of our data across different tasks that GRAs perform in a given workday. And then we coalesce these tasks, the tasks into bundles, and began then coding for the characteristics of these tasks to better understand how spaces for discretion change when you have AM in place. One of the nice things about our respondents was that many had started using these systems within like the last 5 years or so, but had actually been in the sector for much longer. So we were able to ask them to compare before and after what their experience was like. You can see here, so we identify these primary points of intersection in what's called room sequencing. This is deciding the order of rooms, the order in which you are going to clean them. This is related to that process of allocation that AM is supposed to be augmenting. And this is where we see the most salient effects on discretion and decision-making, with these secondary effects on the actual cleaning rooms, the actual making the beds, vacuuming, cleaning the bathrooms, and then interacting with guests. So I'm going to show you briefly what these look like with some of our data. So room sequencing is highly consequential. When you have a paper list, GRAs can decide, the order in which I'm going to clean the rooms. They may make those decisions based on preferences. For example, maybe they do 2 checkout rooms, which are really labor intensive, and then they do a stayover to give their bodies a break. Right, so there's these preferences they can meet, but there's also contingencies or uncertainties that they address through sequencing. They may encounter a trashed room, right? I have a toddler at home. I know how quickly rooms can get trashed. So if you have a trashed room that requires extra time, all of a sudden your entire work schedule has to be shifted. You may have supply problems. A lot of hotels subcontract out their linens, and if inventory isn't managed well, they may not have all their supplies they need to actually finish their work. They may encounter guest demands, like a VIP who arrives early and wants to check in, and all of a sudden they have these rushed rooms. So there's kind of some constraints that they have, but generally they have wide latitude in how to account for all these sources of uncertainty when they're using their paper systems. In the application, the order is given to you by the AM technology, right? And it's not something that you can actually move around. And so GRAs talk about this spatial inefficiency of assignments. It's optimizing room flow, but it's not necessarily optimizing labor. So you may have extra travel time. If you have carts that weigh a couple hundred pounds and you're pushing them across the carpets, that adds on to wear and tear on your body. But you're less able to address those kinds of contingencies because you're kind of wedded to the order in which you are given your room assignments in the application, right? So this is uncertainty actually increases while the space for discretion decreases. And it's the number one thing that we typically hear about this technology. Within room, these tasks tend to be a little bit more standardized. You arrive at a preference for how you want to clean a room. Maybe you like to vacuum first or clean the bathroom first. You kind of develop your rhythm, and that allows you to actually get the work done quickly and efficiently so that you can kind of make decisions about when things have been done to standard, right? So, and we really see kind of marginal kind of effects at the kind of outskirts of decision making in terms of, there are certain uncertainties within rooms. If you encounter that trashed room, you maybe have to recalculate how well you're going to get a particular task done to meet standards. But GRAs really do talk about mostly just the fact that having to constantly engage with the system infringes on their time and then makes actually getting their work done more difficult because there's constant engagement with an app that is actually quite unfamiliar often to many GRAs. So we don't see a lot of changes in the space for discretion here. We do see some changes in service interactions, as interactions with guests. So these may, it could be like, we ask for an extra towel or something in the cart, right? But a lot of interactions also provide data points that GRAs use to make decisions about their sequencing. And so they may observe families with suitcases leaving the room and going to the elevator. They may know there's a checkout before the front desk does. And they can make decisions about information they gather about when they need to go, for example, knock on a door to find out if they can enter a room. With AM, those decisions are kind of removed. That chance to apply that information, those observations are removed, and you're prompted by the technology about when you should go enter. There's kind of an issue with a lot of these technologies of guests kind of checking out but not necessarily leaving. And so GRAs often encounter annoyed guests who don't want to be bothered. And the same can happen under paper systems, but the difference here is that the prompt to make that decision about when to go knock on the door is being given to them by the technology as opposed to their own information. And so there's just this perception that those kinds of changes are causing additional kind of stress or taking away control, perceived control over their work process. So we see these high impacts in room sequencing, moderate impacts where we see low saliency or low frequency, and low uncertainty in tasks such as guest interactions and cleaning rooms. And I'll just briefly note, because I'm running out of time, that GRAs really describe this as moving from having your rhythm to a stop, drop, and roll. That when you lose control of that decision making, that's what the effect feels like. And in our paper, we actually trace this out to implications for well-being at work, kind of work intensity, and identify a number of moderators that introduce some variation in these experiences, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great presentation. How do roles managed by algorithms create or block pathways to upward mobility?
That's an interesting question. So in this setting, these are relatively flat organizations. Most times GRAs, if they're moving up the ranks, will go into a supervisor or dispatcher kind of position, but you may only have one or two of those per shift. So even in a large hotel, those opportunities kind of don't, they're few and far between. That being said, we have seen, we've heard anecdotally about some ways that the kind of all this information that is being tracked about GRAs is sometimes used to evaluate performance. One of the kind of challenges to that, or oftentimes managers in hotels don't actually know how to use the data very well. That this incredible amount of data they have around work days, we haven't actually seen it being put to use. So some indication that there's monitoring and evaluation happening in here, but it is, since it's a relatively flat organization, I think the effects would be more likely in performance as opposed to mobility upwards.
What is the net impact on the hotel P&L? Like on one hand, you have loss of flexibility or like perceived control, but maybe the productivity will go up because hopefully the AI is making better decisions than they would have otherwise. Or maybe in some instances, they would actually be happier because they don't have to do all the thinking. They just have to do the next thing.
Yeah, so this, we have heard, there is some, one of the things that we hear, like one of the benefits of this is having information, and some GRAs do talk about, it's great, I don't have to make the decisions, but that also varies depending on how it's managed, right? So if you are constrained to a certain area of the hotel, if you're not sent back and forth to different floors, right, there's a condition to those kinds of benefits. It's not very clear that there's productivity, like labor cost savings that are being borne out of this. The efficiency is really coming on the management side, where the process, if you could imagine a 5,000 room casino or resort hotel, the process of breaking out rooms in the morning takes multiple people, multiple hours, and that's where the real kind of savings has come in.
If there are no more questions, then lunchtime. We have 75 minutes for lunch.